And then in 2013, Assad used chemical weapons against his own population. President Obama had said that was a red line, and if he did, there would be a swift American military response. And you will remember very clearly that, first of all, in Britain, the House of Commons voted against it. There were Conservative and Liberal Democrat rebels. It was a coalition. But the reason that was defeated was because Ed Miliband, the leader of the Labour Party, to our complete surprise, voted against it. And then, perhaps more importantly in the history of things, Obama, having seen what happened in the House of Commons and with Congress getting increasingly agitated, having again seen what happened in Britain, didn't see through his threat. And that opened the door to the Assad regime surviving, Russia stepping in, sending in troops. And you could argue, if you want a real kind of domino theory, that it emboldened Putin to believe that the West was weak and that they wouldn't intervene in Ukraine when he seized Crimea and everything that's flowed since then. So it was a really pivotal moment. And at that moment, once the House of Commons voted against military action in Syria, military strikes against Syria, all of our influence essentially evaporated.
That's right. And of course, in that House of Commons in 2013, everything was happening in the shadow immediately of Libya and the intervention the year before, which had then become quite chaotic, but in particular Iraq 10 years before, and the sense that the British government, with cross-party support, had joined with the Americans in the removal of Saddam Hussein, but that there wasn't a plan for the aftermath, and it became chaotic and terrible, and with a huge amount of regret expressed for having gone into that conflict in that way in the first place. And I was reading the David Cameron biography, and he clearly felt as though there was a big portion of his own cabinet who were very cautious about getting involved in an incursion into Syria on the rebel side, or to aid the rebels against Bashar, let alone Liberal Democrats, let alone Labour voices.
I can't believe you were very comfortable voting against that, knowing you pretty well now.
Well, let us get to what I was feeling about it in a second. But first of all, to set this up, in that Cameron biography, he talks about the Deputy National Security Advisor, a guy we both know really well called Hugh Powell. Hugh Powell, son of Charles Powell, Margaret Thatcher's foreign policy advisor. I'd been out with him at Harvard in the late 1980s. It was Hugh who, on behalf of the British government, was kind of gathering representatives from US, France, Turkey, Jordan, Saudi Arabia, UAE, Qatar, early in 2013, trying to find a way to support those opposition forces in Syria. Hugh then, when that vote happens, David Cameron records in his biography Hugh saying that in retrospect he wishes that he had spoken up. Hugh Powell later told me, says Cameron, how much he regretted not speaking up. For him, the politicians were taking a very big decision about Parliament very quickly without discussing the risks or alternatives, i.e. putting this to a vote in the Commons, which could then be overturned. And so I thought we should find out how Hugh feels about those 2013 events in the light of what we've seen over the last week. And so I got in touch with him and asked him, I asked, looking at current events in Syria and then back 11 years ago, how do you feel now about the 2013 House of Commons vote? So this is David Cameron as Deputy National Security Advisor reflecting on 2013 in the light of 2024.
Well, I feel the same now as I did that day of the bloody vote. It was a massive mistake by the Commons then, and feels like 11 wasted years now. The key point here is that the Assad regime has always been fragile. Few of its forces were really prepared to fight and die for it then. 2013 was an opportunity to help crack it, well before Hezbollah and Russia came to its rescue. And with Assad gone, we had a good chance of installing a power-sharing government in Damascus that might well have prevented the hidden expansion of ISIS. I think there are a few other lessons from 2012 to 15, and indeed from Libya before. First, the UN can't really be in the lead. It's a back door for continued Russian influence, and it has no enforcement power. Second, there'll have to be a dirty deal between those with power on the ground, principally the main militias, but also the rump Alawite forces. A UN approach based on constitutions, elections, and civil society won't prevent things rapidly slipping back into civil war. There needs to be some sort of Lebanon-like power-sharing deal. It'll be an awful mess, but better than more war. And third, there needs to be some external enforcement to deter and punish any attempts by any group to grab unilateral power. We've learned how the winner-takes-all mentality undermined the Arab Spring almost everywhere else. So, given Trump has clearly signalled the US won't play the central role, I think the only realistic option now is for the UK government to encourage Turkey to be the key player on both the political and the military tracks. We need a Turkish Holbrooke and something like the Dayton process.
So that reference at the end from Hugh, who just reminds me, by the way, in that clip, what a creative and interesting official he was to have working with us, and constantly kind of challenging some of the lazy assumptions of the British security establishment at the time. He references there Turkey, and he talks about a Turkish Holbrooke for those, and Dayton. For those who don't know what that means, there was a very creative American diplomat called Dick Holbrooke, and he was the architect of the Dayton Accords, which brought an end to the Yugoslav civil war, which people at the time thought was intractable, a bit like the Syrian civil war. What did you make of Hugh's reflections?
Look, as you say, Hugh is always thoughtful and reflective and very sort of hard-headed and pragmatic. And he's completely right that in these situations, diplomacy is about what can actually be done. It's the art of the possible, not the ideal. And he must be right to say that rather than crossing your fingers and hope that some kind of democratic solution is going to emerge, which feels so unlikely, some kind of power-sharing arrangement must be the right way forward. And, I think if I was Kurdish, I'd be quite worried about it being Turkish driven, but it's that is the reality of the situation on the ground. But there is a massive difference between this situation and 2013, which is this has happened to everyone's surprise. We've all been sort of slightly caught off guard, and the question is, so what do we do now? Whereas in 2013, the question wasn't, this has happened, what do we do? It's, do we choose to go in and make this happen? Do we take ownership of it? Do we lead it? And as Hugh said, it's going to be an awful mess in 2024, but an awful mess is better than more civil war. In 2013, the question for David Cameron, for you in the cabinet, was, are we going to lead and trigger something which is likely to become an awful mess? And I think what was going on in your cabinet, in Parliament, as people would have been saying, but Iraq turned out to be an awful mess, and Libya turned out to be an awful mess, and if this is another awful mess, David Cameron says in his biography, he asked the security chiefs, should we do this? And they were very cautioning because they said, you might well make this worse. This may just be a bad situation. And so I think the reality, I was really worried about Labour on that day, looking like we were standing against international action to tackle an evil dictator. But all of us were worried that we didn't know what the plan was, and it was a roll of the dice for Britain to be in the lead on it, and that is different to today. And I understand why the House of Commons was so worried in that vote.
But quite often in diplomacy and chaotic world events, it is a bit of a roll of the dice. You don't know what's going to happen, and always saying, "Where's the exit plan?" Well, sometimes in life it's hard to work out what an exit plan is. But I would say, when I was in my 20s, you kind of learnt the price of not intervening. We didn't intervene in Rwanda. We didn't intervene early enough in the Yugoslav civil war, and millions of people died. And that prompted this kind of doctrine of intervention, which led to the Iraq war. And then after that, we went back to we're not doing that again.
No, but then we learned in the Iraq War the dangers of intervening when you don't actually know what your plan is.
But now
you aren't being straight with people about what your objective is, and you don't do the planning for the aftermath. And it set back the ability of Britain and America to be foreign policy leaders for a generation.
But there's also a price of non-intervention, which is harder sometimes to see. But, not trying to resolve the Syrian civil war earlier. Forget about the suffering that the Syrian people have endured for the last 10 years as a result. Look at the massive migration flows into Germany, the pressures that put on European governments, the collapse of more moderate centrist administrations. Ultimately, the small boats that are kind of come across the English Channel are prompted by chaos in other parts of the world. And, I would say, if the Starmer government thinks this is not... this is all happening somewhere else and it doesn't affect them. You wait 6 months and those minorities like the Alawites and the Christians in Syria might well be turning up on the beaches of Dover.
But the problem is, George, as you know, that the counterfactual argument is always so hard to make because we don't know what would have happened. And we don't know if after an intervention in 2013 to back the rebel forces, we don't know if the reaction and the suffering and the migration flows would have been lesser or would have been greater. That is always your calculation. The difference today is we can go and sort out a problem which is not in this moment been of our direct making. In the end in 2013, it wasn't Labour which stopped this. It wasn't even the British Parliament which stopped this. It was actually the fact that the American president changed his mind, or maybe he never was really in the right place in the first place. I mean, it was the US which decided not to intervene in Syria in August 2013, and maybe Britain served him up a big excuse.
Yeah, I'm sure that is right. I mean, he could have proceeded, but he didn't, and that was partly because Congress, as I say, was affected by what was going on here. Anyway,
if I was the British government, if I was the British government, I'd be ringing up Hugh Powell and saying,
come back from California
and bring us your experience from 2013, and previous to that, he had a kind of long career, and help us work out the plan.